Hello again, everyone, and welcome to the latest in our series of lockdown webcasts that we're bringing to you from Travel Weekly to keep you all connected as we are continuing to work from home during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm joined today by three experts in their fields. I'm delighted to say we've got Alan Bowen, who is the legal advisor to the Association of Atol Companies. So welcome, Alan. We've also got Giles, Hawke, who is the Chief Executive of Cosmos and Avalon. So hi, Giles. And finally, we've got Paul Charles, who is the founder and Chief Executive Officer of the PC Agency. So thank you all very much for joining me. We've got a lot I want to cover today, so I'm going to kick straight off with talking about the latest guidance from the government that we heard on Sunday. I think the key thing for the travel industry is obviously this quarantine, the 14-day quarantine period that they are definitely they've confirmed they're going to introduce that. We don't know when, we don't know how long it will last, so that's a problem because we're all obviously now very worried about that, but we don't really know how worried we need to be. But I guess I wanted to ask you, you know, people are now saying, well, that's it, that's just wiped out the summer. Is that your view? Matt Hancock this morning, the health secretary on the television was basically saying summer's cancelled. Pretty likely that's the end of it. So do you agree? Let's start with you, Alan.
Unfortunately, yes, I think it is. The AAC had an online meeting last Thursday, and we all took the view that there will be very little travel, if any, before the fourth quarter, so from September onwards. And I think the quarantine issue has really stymied any realistic early startup. Having said that, Ryanair this morning were claiming that on the 1st of July they'd start flying and that everybody will be going to Italy and Greece and Spain. Well, Spain they certainly won't be going to unless they want to spend a fortnight in quarantine when they arrive and then come back and have another fortnight when they get home. I mean, the whole issue is there is no clarity at all. We were hoping that yesterday in this wonderful 50-page document that turned out to be 60 pages, so they hadn't even counted the number of pages before announcing it, would actually explain what was happening, but there's no explanation at all. So we don't know when it's starting, although we've given notice it's probably going to be at the end of the month or the beginning of June, which means those who want to come back can do so before it starts. We've given no indication of how long it's going to go on. I mean, I'm very concerned that today the furlough benefit system is going to continue to October. So the government clearly expect that this issue of corona being a huge problem for everybody is going to go on for a considerable period of time. It's not going to be finished anytime soon. So I suspect September may well be the earliest we will see any departures. Okay.
Do you agree, Giles? I mean, is there you know, any way to stop these quarantine measures sort of wiping out the rest of the summer, or are you in agreement with Alan?
I'm in agreement with Alan. I think it's you know, I think people have talked about too little, too late, and this is very much like waiting till the full-time whistle and then thinking, oh, we'll put our top striker on. You know, this should have been done months ago. It should have been done at the start of the lockdown. Other countries were doing it way before we even sort of thought about it. We're way behind the curve, and you can see why they're doing it. But at the same time, to loosen up other rules just doesn't make sense. So I think both for outbound tourism and for inbound tourism, and we have an arm of our business that we bring tens of thousands of people into the UK from the US, Canada, Australia every summer. When it wipes that out for the summer as well, we're just about to, or this week, we're announcing cancelling all of our programs for July and August. We'd already gone till the end of June. We're cancelling the end of August now. So the earliest...
In light of this quarantine announcement?
We'd actually made that decision last week, but we're announcing this week, just because we can't see it coming back that quickly and there being sufficient demand to make it sort of viable to run the coach tours and run the river cruises. I suppose the only possible positive in all of this is as we start to see some relaxation domestically, there may be some opportunities for domestic operators selling to Brits travelling in Britain. But even there, you know, there's no clarity about when that might happen. We've got a big domestic programme. We're looking at how we can sell that to Brits, but we're going to focus on Q1 2021 for departures because we just can't see any clarity or any chance of anything realistic before then. But then at the same time,
you could sell to France as well, though, couldn't you, Giles?
Well, potentially, but who in this sort of environment, You know, you've got to say, where is the customer confidence for making a booking to travel somewhere further than, you know, further than sort of away for a day or for a few hours as it stands today. But, you know, if we're going to start opening schools, if we're going to start opening sort of outdoor public places, gradually we might see other places opening. That's assuming we don't see another spike. And my sense is a lot of people are just assuming we're going to see another spike in several weeks' time and we'll have another full lockdown.
Okay. I mean, I'll bring you in, Paul. I mean, Giles made that point there around consumer confidence. I mean, if people were thinking, all right, I might get away for the end of summer, or I've got the confidence to book for autumn, winter, this word quarantine, this latest announcement, is that pretty much curtains for people, you know, being confident about travelling?
I think the quarantine measures are crushing for the sector. There was hope before these measures were announced or leaked and then announced. And I think, you know, bookings were still coming through, especially in the luxury end of the sector, where there were pretty decent bookings, some very big bookings indeed for private villas overseas for next year. But what the quarantine measures are measures which have been seen to work elsewhere. So we've seen them work effectively in New Zealand, for example, or in Vietnam, places which I represent, but which have seen 0 deaths or very few deaths and low numbers of infections. So the quarantine measures have worked overseas, and the government has clearly looked at those and thought, yes, now's the time we need to introduce them. Clearly,
they worked in New Zealand, and sorry to interrupt, but presumably they worked in those two destinations because, to Giles's point, they introduced them much sooner along the road.
Absolutely. They were introduced early on, and with coronavirus, there is one thing we do know, and that's that you have to move fast, you have to act with certainty, and move as hard as you can to restrict it. That's one certainty we do have in this whole crisis. But what quarantine does is take away from the sector any visibility. What it's doing is saying to consumers, well, we're in effect closing our borders, because that's in effect what a quarantine is. Nobody's going to rightly come back in quarantine for 2 weeks or come into the country in the first place. And the government likes that because it's seen as a medical measure, putting the health of the nation before the economic health of the nation, despite the success of furlough schemes. And so, as we've heard, we're not going to see any overseas travel to speak of for some months yet. And indeed, the FCO advice is you can't travel unless it's essential anyway. So the domestic market will be very strong at some point.
Okay. Yeah, well, we'll come back to the furlough scheme. Both of you have mentioned that, and I want to come back to that in a minute. But just in terms of the, in terms of what people, what should, what should agents and operators be telling customers then? They've previously been going where they can. I know they've been dealing a lot with the refunds, but they've been obviously saying you can still book for, the future, and you can still, take your refund credit notes, or, they're trying to still have this confidence. But what should they be saying now? Alan, let's come to you.
It's very difficult, is the honest answer. I know a lot of people initially at the start thought that perhaps by July and August, holidays would have begun again. And a lot of people rebooked for 4 months after they'd planned to go. And clearly those holidays aren't going to happen. And one of the big issues that's arisen because of the refund credit note is that people have been very reluctant to pay final balances, because they could see that if they did, they weren't going to get the money back when it was cancelled. And that's become a real problem for travel agents. Some operators have been very good, and they've made it clear exactly when they'll be in a position to refund. I fear that some of them said it will be the 31st of July, because that was the first date that ABTA proposed. Yeah. And of course, now, by the 31st of July, there'll be virtually nothing operating, if anything at all. And therefore, the cash flow that they probably hoped would have started by then may well not have begun. We are in a very difficult position. I mean, literally 15 minutes ago, I had a call from one of my clients who was selling a holiday for next March. And the customer's question was, well, what is travel going to be like in March next year? And he rang me for an answer. And I don't have an answer of what it's going to be like in a fortnight, never mind March 2021. And that is the real problem. This quarantine could be for a month, it could be for a year, it could be for 3 months. We have no idea, and neither have the government. This is making it up as they go along. They clearly told Airports UK in advance that they were planning to introduce it. And Airports UK then linked the story to the press in the hope there'd be outcry and the government would change their mind. And in fact, the consumer has said, actually, that seemed like a very good idea. The problem is, in the intervening 7 weeks, we've had 100,000 people come back, some of whom will have undoubtedly brought the virus back into the UK. So it's far too late, but it's being seen to do something.
Well, what do we need from government now? Do we need, presumably, clarity on how long this quarantine is going to be in place for is key, because then presumably agents and operators can start planning again. But clarity from the government has been in short supply, I would suggest, over the last 7 weeks. So are we, is it going to be a rolling thing? I mean, are we likely to get any kind of clarity on how long this quarantine will last?
I doubt it. I think at least we could start with when it's going to begin and an indication that it will be at least, and so they could say it will be at least for 8 weeks, for example, which would take out June and July. I suspect it may well be for longer than that. But then the question is, how are they going to enforce this? Over in Ireland, they've had a quarantine system for the last 2 months, but it simply required customers to fill in a form when they arrive back at Dublin Airport and hand it in to a member of staff. And they released the figures last week. 34% of people arriving at Dublin didn't fill in the form at all. So, if there isn't any form of enforcement, it's completely pointless. I do wonder whether that will actually be the case.
I think it's very easy for the UK government to introduce quarantine. It's harder to remove it. It's very similar to the lockdown. Very easy to stop the country with 48 hours notice. But as Boris Johnson and the rest of the cabinet are finding out, it's much harder to unravel it, to unlock the lockdown. And the same applies to quarantine. Once you put it in place, there's no major incentive for governments to move fast to get out of quarantine, to bring the country out of quarantine. And this is the problem that the airlines particularly, as well as the rest of the travel industry, are facing. There's no opportunity to restart. So at every moment where they've had an opportunity to restart and think about how to build up flights again, and British Airways and Ryanair today announcing they will start flights from the 1st of July. At every moment they've tried to restart, the government has then said, well, actually, we're going to have to go back a bit and think about the medical priorities, the health priorities of this country. So all of us in business are trying to restart, but actually it's proving very hard to do that. And we're having to think about restructure instead of restart.
Okay. And ultimately, what's the impact of this? I mean, it's going to presumably put much more financial pressure onto businesses, undoubtedly. Could it lead to more failures? Might some businesses just look at this and just throw in the towel and just say, I can't exist for another 3 months not getting any income into my business?
Absolutely. We're seeing already, even before furlough was introduced, there are a number of companies who are making redundancies. Since furlough has been in place, we've seen airlines talking about, significant numbers of redundancies. We've seen today, even, one of the big cruise companies talking about a big consultation around redundancies. I think, if the big companies with deep pockets are seeing these issues, smaller companies are going to find it pretty challenging the longer we go without money coming in. So, furlough definitely helps, because one of the big costs of a lot of companies is people. And if you can help to manage some of your people costs through furlough, then that's a great help. And the fact that it's been extended now, what that will look like after the end of July, we still need to sort of wait to see. But certainly at the end of July, that 80% sounds like it's fixed. So it allows you to say some of that cost is sort of help to be covered. But if you haven't got money coming in, you're not being productive, you're not driving business, somewhere along the line, all our business models are predicated on people booking holidays, spending money on us and using some of that money to pay the suppliers, and the rest becomes profit that you help to use to run your business. If you haven't got that money coming in to run your business, at some point the money dries up. And I think, the longer that goes, the more likely we are to see failures, big and small companies, travel agents, tour operators, who haven't got the money coming in, aren't able to pay suppliers, aren't able to pay customers back. And I think it's a big issue. It's a big challenge we're facing, and I think we haven't seen the size and scale of what's coming yet.
Yeah, would you agree with that, Alan? You must have people ringing you all the time.
I mean, clearly the big problem is that for most operators, the 12 weeks of summer keeps them going for the other 40 weeks of the year. They need to make profit in July and August in order to survive November and December. And the reality is there's no profit going to be in July, probably no profit in August, maybe very little in September. I mean, I think there are going to be huge problems. The CAA are going to have huge problems with renewals at the end of September. I mean, they've admitted that the next set of accounts are going to look horrendous for everybody. So it's really going to be a question of looking to see where the cash flow is. And of course, the reality is there's going to be no cash flow. So unless you've already got money in the bank, or you can get access to money, you're going to be in some difficulties at the end of September, assuming you survive that long. I mean, the real problem will be when consumers start saying, actually, I've decided I've got this voucher, I now want cash. I mean, we've been very lucky. 75% of customers have either rebooked immediately or taken the voucher. When they begin to think, actually, I don't know how long this is going to go on for, and I'm furloughed, or worse, I've been made redundant, I want the money back. When push comes to start, we're going to be in some difficulty. We have been incredibly lucky so far. Chargebacks have been far lower than we expected. And it seems the banks themselves are rejecting chargebacks for fear that pushing too many of them onto the company will actually force the company out of business. And then the banks themselves will be liable to pay the customer the money back. While the company is still in existence, the chargeback, of course, goes back to the company. But when it goes out of business, it's the bank.
Yeah, well,
I think some glimmers of hope.
Sorry, Paul, go on.
I do think there are some glimmers of hope. I mean, there are some people, quite a lot actually, especially over the age of 60, 65, who've retired, who are not spending very much, and they're sitting on money that they might have spent going out. And I think it's the CBR, the Centre for Economics and Business Research, who've said there's some £23 billion which is not being spent, which is just sitting there in people's savings accounts that would normally be spent. So there will be pockets where people do spend, and it's not one broad brush. And clearly domestically, where we're going to have to travel to because we can't leave the country, or we can in a common travel area of the island of Avalon as well, those are where the pockets of success are going to be over the next few months. But in the main, you're going to see, I think, consolidation among major players and small players especially, who are desperate just for any form of cash. So there'll be mergers taking place in about 3 or 4 months' time. It won't just be a sorry tale of redundancies, it'll be a tale of substantial restructuring and consolidation in order to create new business models. And what will come out of this that could be quite positive, new business models which define how we're going to travel in future.
Okay. Let's just go back to that furlough scheme that you've all mentioned. Giles, you were just saying there that you were referencing Carnival, which has obviously announced a consultation period with a number of its staff. Which is interesting, isn't it? But it announced it on the day that the furlough scheme was extended. So, you know, would that suggest that the furlough scheme actually isn't beneficial, or, you know, the lifeline that we need it to be in the travel industry? I mean, people have said right from the start that, yes, it's been great, I guess, to stave off initial redundancies, but it doesn't actually solve the problem for travel, because you still need people in your business working on the phones, dealing with all these cancellations and amendments, of which we're now going to have even more because of the extended quarantine period. So, you know, does the, you know, I know you say furlough is a good thing, but is it, you know, universally good for the travel industry, Alan?
Oh, it can be, and there is a suggestion from August that there can be a split so that people will be able to do some work with a reduced amount of money coming from the government. Now, that's been one of the big problems, that we've needed staff in the offices or working from home to deal with refunds, to deal with cancellation and rebooking, and we haven't been able to use them because we couldn't afford to pay the full wage. So we had to say, stay at home and do nothing. Now, it's a pity it's going to be August, but there has been a lot of talk about the need to get people to do some work, perhaps not full time, and for the government to adjust. And they have indicated today that they will do that from August, but August seems a long time away.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you think that the travel and hospitality industry should have had special treatment? And do you think it's still worth us lobbying to get special treatment because of the sort of the nature of our business, that, you know, work is still needing to be done?
I would say yes, and I would say we should also be lobbying for support for longer, because once everything else restarts, the travel and hospitality industry is probably going to be one of the last industries to restart properly. And even when we start getting bookings in, they're going to be bookings for quite some time in the future. So the sort of bulk of business you'd expect in the summer months that sees you through the winter, that's not going to happen. And even though we'll be taking deposits and bookings for next spring and next summer, you know, you're talking about deposits. You're not talking about the money that helps a business to keep running. So even then, when pubs and bars and restaurants are open, hopefully, you know, in the autumn, back end of the year, they're seeing full amounts of money coming in for the full service provided. They're able to generate the sort of bigger sums of money they would be used to. You know, the full payment happens at that time. We're taking small payments. And so we won't, in travel and hospitality, we won't see the real money come in until people actually are about to travel about a year from now and onwards from there. So I think, you know, there is an argument to say, if we want a travel industry, if we want a travel industry that actually has liquidity and is going to survive, we need some government support. Now, whether that comes in the way of loans to see us through that period, whether that comes in the way of grants, you know, I think it is worth lobbying for further support from government to help the travel and tourism industry.
Okay. All right, I'm conscious of time and I want to move on to the future. Paul mentioned there were some positives, I guess, some glimmers of hope. You know, there are some people who might have available income and they might want to go away. Let's talk about that. You know, if we are to sort of reopen up the world and we're able to get travel moving again, obviously there's some key issues, aren't there? Some fundamentals about how we're going to do this whilst maintaining social distancing. And I know, Paul, you wrote an article that we published in on our website around where the onus should lie. And you very much felt that the onus, certainly for the air piece, should lie with the airport in terms of testing to make sure people were safe to travel, rather than with the airline. So I just wanted to pick up on that and perhaps get your view, Giles, on where, you know, what the responsibility is of the tour operator. So let's start with you, Paul.
Yeah, I think it's going to be confidence-led, first of all. It's really important that we're going to have to focus on creating that confidence. Whilst the government's focused on creating confidence medically through social distancing rules that have to last for some time, I think us in the industry are going to have to be very much focused on explaining to people why it's okay and safe to travel and to offer the right deals as a result. So I think you're going to see airlines and operators offering some pretty good deals to help to kickstart, when we can, to get people traveling and booking for 2021. And then it's about making sure that there are best standard practice in place. In fact, the World Travel and Tourism Council have announced today safe travels, global standards that can be consistently put in place in hospitality and other sectors. And I think that's where we're going to have to focus. So we will only travel as consumers when we're confident that we're going to be safely looked after, we've got less risk, and we can travel with confidence. So I think the onus actually is on all of us to do that. Now, in terms of the airports themselves, I honestly believe that confidence will only come for when we're traveling overseas, when the airports are seen to be the safe place and filtering place. I don't think airlines are built for social distancing. You can't, it's ridiculous. Ryanair saying this morning, Mike O'Leary said that you have to put your hand up if you want to go to the loo on a flight. It's crazy. This isn't a way of traveling. It's not going to bring about confidence. So the airport should be tested to make sure that people are COVID-free before they then get anywhere near a plane, which will give people confidence about traveling. It may be difficult, it may be harder, but we're all having to do things in this coronavirus crisis which are not the norm, which are difficult, which are testing us and challenging us. And I think airports have to step up in order to deliver that.
Okay. And Giles, you know, your business, you know, you have planes, you have coaches, you have hotels, you have river cruise ships. That's a lot of different, you know, parts of the holiday that need securing in some way, to Paul's point, to make people feel confident in every step of your trip that you might run. So how are you going to do that?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and it's a very big challenge. I mean, we're the bit we own, if you like, is the river cruise ship. So we're working through all the protocols. We're working with Clear to understand what ocean cruise lines are doing. We're working together with other river cruise lines through Clear so that we can come up with sort of industry best practice. We're looking at deeper cleaning routines. We're looking at what testing might look like. Most of the people who come on our river cruises, or in fact all of our holidays, will have come by air in the vast majority of cases to get there. So there's a bit going back to what Paul said around, well, if the airport is a place where, you know, people get filtered and get tested, you sort of, there's some view that from there, once that's the sort of part of their holiday, from there, they're in a sort of a bit of a bubble. Now, the issue and the challenges around that are when you're in resort, when you're on a coach, when you're doing a shore excursion off of the ship, you know, you're then coming into contact with other people. But that's going to reflect what's happening in day-to-day life anyway. You know, if you go on a coach excursion from a ship and you go to a castle or something, it'll be no different to being at home and going to a shopping centre. People are going to do those things. We're going to get used to wearing face masks, social distancing, different ways of behaving. And those sort of, I guess those protocols are going to be in place globally, not just locally, because we're all dealing with the same issue. You know, longer term, one hopes that a vaccine will be found, and ultimately some sort of, maybe not necessarily a cure, but some way of treating the symptoms so that, you know, it's a much less sort of virulent strain of sort of flu virus, so that it's less likely to kill. But I guess it's working with the rules that are in place at the moment, working what is being seen elsewhere in the world, and come out with our own best practice as well as sharing that, because this shouldn't be a competitive environment. You know, I don't think any holiday company, airline should be going out there saying, you know, we run a safer operation with regards to COVID-19 or any other virus than somebody else. I think we should be working together to create best practice.
You say that, but we're getting an awful lot of press releases from people with villa holidays. I mean, Paul mentioned it as well, private villas, or I guess places which you can self-drive to, where you can then be on your own. You know, I think people are saying that this is, you know, an option that you might want to consider. I mean, they're not dissing anybody else, that wouldn't be right. But, you know, do you see that kind of holiday becoming more popular, or certainly booked more readily than, you know, one where you're sort of with a lot of people in a confined space?
I think there are styles of holiday that might come back quicker than other styles of holiday. So ones where you have more space, ones where you're more likely to be just in your family unit or your friend unit, will probably return much quicker than ones where you're going to be mixing with a lot of people in close proximity. But I think, you know, I don't think we're talking a year or 2 years. I think we're talking, you know, several months to get to that stage where those first styles are sort of seen as a way forward. And I think, you know, end of the year, early part of next year, I would expect we'll see other types of travel return sort of fairly quickly, because, you know, necessity is a mother of invention. We will learn how to, you know, airports will learn how to run these protocols to work for airlines, because airlines will pressure them. We'll learn how to make things work on river cruise ships. There'll become sort of standards for coach travel, whether it be, you know, for holidays or for standard travel. There'll be standards for going on a tube, on a train.
But that all comes at a cost, doesn't it? I know earlier you were saying that we might see prices come down, but actually some of these measures that the industry is going to have to adhere to, as you say, global standards, you know, that comes at a cost. And also, if we are, you know, Paul was saying earlier about the luxury sector still sort of standing up a little bit better because people can go off to these private islands and travel in a little bit more space. I mean, again, that's usually comes with a higher price. So, you know, is there a danger that travel could become the preserve of the elite again? And that sort of, you know, is it the end of the days of mass market holidays?
I think so. I mean, I think actually, you know, destinations who I represent are talking already about resetting and resetting for higher value, less volume. So I really think we are at a turning point. And I also think what Giles was saying about returning perhaps later next year, I hope they do. I'd love it to happen. But I think bearing in mind that 62% of the world's aircraft are grounded, it's going to take 3 or 4 years for airlines to put anything like the schedules they used to have at the end of 2019 back in place. So if the airlines are not fit for purpose and ready until 2023, let's say, then I reckon there's 3 years of hardship and difficulty in us changing what we're selling, who we're selling to. I honestly think the whole market is going to change substantially in terms of target markets, who's got money, and where people are happy to go to. It's going to take years to rebuild some of the healthcare systems around the world. Yeah. And so some of the more adventurous destinations that have been popular and growing in recent years, we won't want to go to. We might not want to go to cities as much as we used to. We might want the space that Giles has been talking about and the privacy. And fundamentally, we won't have the choice or the value to be able to take the decisions we used to take. There won't be so many destinations to fly to, and it'll be expensive to get to certain places. I think we're in for a massive shake-up in this industry.
Do you agree with that, Alan? I know the members of your association aware of that, thinking along those lines, that they're going to have to change?
Yes, I mean, a lot of them sell to the US, for example, and the carriers are saying that fares might fall for a short period after they start up again, but on the longer term, they will have to go up. I mean, somebody will have to pay for all this. And of course, testing at airports sounds relatively simple. It isn't, and it's time consuming. I mean, here in the UK, we had to send 50,000 tests to the US last week because we didn't have sufficient lab power. I mean, it's just crazy. And there was talk by the CEO of Heathrow of people queuing in a kilometre queue for security, of being there 4 hours before departure. That doesn't really sound like a holiday to a lot of people. It sounds like torture. And I think we're going to have to move a good way down the line before we see a lot of people wanting to do, as they do now, short breaks to Poland for weekends. They're not going to suddenly return. I think, as Paul said, I think city breaks are going to be a real issue, because that's where you're on public transport, you're confined in a space with a lot of people. I mean, nobody in the right mind will be traveling on the London Tube at the moment. And that's despite the fact that 90% of people aren't traveling on the Tube. And I think we've got to look at a lot of issues before we see the market back to the way it was last year.
Okay. Now, I'm conscious I've got you here, and I want to just cover a couple of other issues which are slightly separate, but I just want to talk about insurance and maybe talk to you, Alan. It seems that insurance is going to be harder to come by, both as a consumer and if you're a supplier in the industry. So what impact is that going to have going forward?
It's already having an impact, because people who are rebooking for next year find that the insurance they've already bought for this year's holiday, they can't transfer to next year from a large number of suppliers. Those who go out to buy new insurance find it's a great deal more expensive. And in fact, I was talking to an insurance broker this morning who said, well, at the moment, the advice is against travel to any destination. And if that advice was still the case when they were due to travel next year, they'd effectively have no valid insurance at all. So if they wanted to cancel because they broke the leg the week before they were due to travel, for example, which would have been a valid insurance claim, they wouldn't be able to claim. Because if you're booking and planning to travel against FCO advice, the insurance is void. So that's a big problem for the consumer, and that's obviously a big problem for travel agents and tour operators who want to make sure that their customers are insured. But as you rightly said, it's not just the consumer, it's the industry. Those who had business disruption cover have discovered that some of the very large and supposedly very reputable insurance companies aren't paying out, and indeed the FCA is looking at taking legal action against them. There is a big problem now with trying to get credit insurance against large chains of agents, because what seemed to be a very successful and long-term business for an insurer suddenly becomes a business that they don't know whether it's got any future at all. And what operators are very concerned about is they don't want to be back in the situation they were 6 months ago, when travel agents named Thomas Cook had collected huge amounts of money in advance, hadn't passed any of it on, and of course the tour operators were left holding the baby. And that, of course, leads to the whole issue of, if there are a large number of failures, can the Air Travel Trust pay out? The answer clearly is no. And the government are going to have to dip into their pockets again if that is the outcome.
Okay. Anybody want to add to that? I think Alan's probably covered that pretty succinctly. It is a problem. The other thing
I think it's just about trust.
Paul, yes, please.
It's trust fundamentally. The travel industry didn't get to a great start at the beginning of coronavirus because of the refunds issue. That is being worked on, but there are still so many thousands of refunds needed, and the customer services teams are under huge pressure. Even if you take Ryanair, who says for 25 million refunds to be done, that's extreme. But even for a small operator, it's very hard being able to process these, especially if they've got staff who are furloughed. So the trust barometer is very low at the moment in the sector, and that's not going to help for future bookings. And we could well see the industry, I've said before, the airline industry will be 50% smaller over the next year. For the wider industry, it could easily be 50% smaller based on the fact there's no visibility on when quarantine measures are lifted or when the FCO advice is changed. So from an insurance point of view, people won't even be asking for insurance, and that may mean, as I say, more domestic holidays, people not taking insurance at all because they can't afford it or can't get it.
So on this point about domestic holidays, if I'm a travel agent, should I be now looking to, push more domestic holidays, to try and, get agreements in place with domestic holiday operators? There's not that many out there that do work with the trade and pay a commission. So, that's what agents need in order to make their business work. They need to have an earning. So would you be advising them to look at that sector more?
Well, I would just say the domestic market is the one in the short term that is going to do well. I would think certainly over the next 2 years, domestic is the place to be. And so if I was running an agent, I'd be looking at growing my domestic business in light of the fact I won't be selling as much international business. So the domestic market should grow. People want to be close to home. They'll want to be close to home for family reasons, for health reasons, and also for certainty, knowing they don't have to cross a border. And so if I was in the agency business, I'd definitely be advising to do more domestic, and I will be from a PR point of view as well.
Okay, all right. Right, another question, just again, it's slightly left field, but we have been running some stories about how some of the bigger players have been taking certain actions in this crisis. For example, withholding payments to hoteliers in certain destinations. It's happened in Spain, it's happened in the Caribbean, and that's obviously having a knock-on effect to the rest of the industry. Is that to be expected? Is that kind of what they do because they're bigger and they can? And what is the impact on the rest of the industry? Is it a big problem, Alan?
It certainly is a big problem because, of course, if you're a small operator using a hotel that's used by a large operator who hasn't paid for holidays that have already taken place, and you, as the small operator, have to cancel a booking, say for June or July, the hotel can't give you the money back because it hasn't been paid by the bigger operator. So it's running right through the whole system. And of course, the problem is the publicity that this story and similar stories has got is telling the consumer that tour operators don't pay money in advance to hotels.
Which is back to the trust issue that Paul pointed out.
Absolutely. People don't believe you when you actually explain that for a small operator, if you don't pay, you don't get the room. And they don't believe now that we even pay airlines before departure. And, trying to explain that that isn't the way it works, unless you own an airline, for example, then there is a real problem because the consumer thinks that we're lying. And you can see in the columns that you have every day, a certain person writes and tells you that it's clearly not true because he's seen it. And the problem is that's the issue. It is, as Paul has said, a question of trust. People don't believe what we're telling them.
And so the answer, so what is the answer then going forward? I mean, perhaps to come to you, Paul, you say it's an issue, the trust barometer is low. As an industry, what do we need to do in terms of I don't mean marketing necessarily in terms of getting sales in, but just, the way we promote ourselves as an industry? What does the industry, whether it's from the agent level, the supplier, the airlines, what do we need to do to make sure we get that consumer trust back up?
Well, I think there are going to be two things needed in due course, although it's still too early to do any of these until there's more visibility. But one is undoubtedly going to be repositioning A lot of businesses are going to have to reposition, not just restructure as they try to restart, but reposition what they're for. And that's going to mean rebuilding confidence among consumers and getting them to book. So companies should be, travel brands are going to have to be asking themselves, what are we for now? Where are we focusing on? How are we going to show that we care? And
does the sustainability point come into that? That's been a big issue, hasn't it? People saying this actually is a watershed moment and it could turn us more into sort of a responsible travel. I know that's something that Avalon and Cosmos have been working very hard on anyway. But should that be something they push to the fore?
Yeah, definitely. I think as part of this reset and restructuring and reposition, it's going to be around how responsible you are as an operator. That doesn't just mean where you're focusing on, where you're sending people to, but also in terms of being responsible in terms of refunds and how you care. So I think customer care teams are going to be the ones that are invested in over the coming weeks and months, and customer services teams will change. They'll become more caring, and the initial answer will be perhaps more of a yes than a no. But aside from that, reposition focus to rebuild trust, it's also going to be about value. And I honestly think that this is going to be a time where consumers may seek and get better value from companies who are going to have to offer good deals initially to get people back and to get income in and to rebuild that confidence. And then when people are happy and have an experience, they'll pay a bit more. Yeah. It's the only way we're going to inject more income and more revenue into this sector at the moment.
Is that something you're doing, Giles? And have you started really marketing yet? I mean, everyone was talking about when's the right time, because, you know, clearly if things can't actually go anywhere, when is the right time to actually start putting those messages out to your customers?
We've sort of cut back on all our marketing. We are still talking to our customers, but we're talking about dreaming, planning, thinking about places they'd like to go. We're really focused on that sort of dreaming, aspirational process. We're not trying to sell anything at the moment. That said, we've got travel agents saying to us that they're getting customer demand, and they're asking us for 2021 prices, and we are selling some holidays for 2021. But I think there's something about trying to be clear what you stand for to customers, why they should book with you, why they should book with you as a tour operator, as a travel agent, explaining to them the value that you add, the way that you work, the values that you have as a business. And I think, you know, we've got business values and we already communicate those. I think we need to do a much better job of communicating our values around doing the right thing for the right reasons. You know, these are inherent values within our business. We probably don't talk about them openly and publicly enough. And I think that's where tour operators and travel agents probably will score well in customer mindset in the future is, you know, we're human beings running businesses, and businesses have values, and those values sort of sit within the people that work within those businesses. So you have to live your values. You can't, you know, say you've got a bunch of values and then the next day behave completely differently. You've got to have those values and live them. They need to be sort of inherent in what you do. And I think, you know, I'm proud of the company that I work for. We've got clear values and we stick by them. We do the right things. We're refunding customers. Yes, we're still having to pay our suppliers, and we're paying our suppliers. You know, but we're doing the right thing all the time. Sometimes that hurts from a business perspective, but I think, you know, those companies who are just focusing on shareholder value rather than their customers and all their business partners, you know, long term, I can't see that customers or partners are going to value them in the future.
Okay. All right. Well, that sounds like a very sensible approach. I hope it works for you, Giles, and for all your members, Alan, and for your clients, Paul. Thank you very much for your time today and your really honest insight and opinions. We're really, really grateful. So thank you to Alan and to Giles and to Paul. Thank you, gentlemen.